You froze again. Derek slammed his helmet onto the ground. 8 times, Lawson. 8. Because of you, 3 of us are dead. He grabbed the failure report and shoved it against her chest, right in front of every instructor, every trainee watching. You don't belong here, you never did. Rebecca didn't flinch, didn't defend herself, didn't say a single word. She just stood there, rifle lowered, eyes straight ahead while the red alarm lights washed over her face. 8 failed combat tests. 1 more and her military career was finished forever. But nobody in that room knew the real reason she kept freezing. And that reason was about to change everything. If this story moves you, please subscribe to this channel right now. Hit the notification bell and follow Rebecca's journey all the way to the end. And drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. The transport vehicle pulled through the gates of Fort Granite just after noon, and the Nevada heat came down like something personal, like the desert itself had decided to test every passenger before they even stepped off. Rebecca Lawson was the last one out. She moved carefully, the way people move when they've learned the hard way that the body doesn't always warn you before it fails. Her left knee had a history medal, scar tissue, and one overseas night she never talked about, and she descended the steel step like she was calculating the exact angle of each footfall. But her eyes were something else entirely. Before her boots even touched the gravel, she had already mapped the gate, the rooftop positions, the angle of the security cameras, and 3 different exits she could use if everything went wrong at once. Old habit, the kind you don't unlearn. She pulled her bag over one shoulder and walked toward the barracks without asking anyone for directions. She already knew where they were. She'd studied the base layout the night before. She studied everything the night before. Inside, she found a bunk in the farthest corner, back against the wall, sightline straight to the door, and began arranging her gear with a precision that looked almost ceremonial. Every item in its exact place, nothing left to chance. A kind of order she imposed on the outside world, because the inside one had stopped cooperating a long time ago. She tucked a faded photograph into the back of her locker before anyone could see it. That evening at dinner, the mess hall had the particular noise of people performing confidence for each other. New trainees sizing each other up. Loud laughs. Deliberate eye contact held just a beat too long. Rebecca sat alone. She ate quickly, kept her back to the wall, and watched the room the way a soldier watches a room, not with hostility, but with the quiet, constant attention of someone who has learned that the moment you stop watching is usually the moment something goes wrong. That's when she first noticed Derek Shaw. He was sitting across the hall with a cluster of trainees who had already arranged themselves around him, like planets around a sun. He was tall, loud in the right ways, and carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who had never once doubted that every room he entered was his to own. He was also staring at her, not with curiosity, with calculation. She recognized the look. She'd seen it before, on men who measured everyone in a room and immediately needed to know where they ranked. Derek had clearly heard her name somewhere, she could tell by the flicker of something that moved across his face when their eyes met. Recognition. And then something that wasn't quite respect. Something closer to opportunity. He leaned in toward the man beside him and said something low enough that she couldn't hear it. 3 of them laughed. Rebecca looked back down at her tray and finished her food. She had dealt with Derek Shaw 100 times before. Different name, different face. Same math. Same need to establish dominance before anyone else could. She wasn't afraid of him. She was afraid of something much harder to see. The next morning started on the rifle range. That's where things began to go visibly, publicly wrong. The qualification drill was standard. The kind of thing Rebecca had done hundreds of times. Stand, aim, fire, reload, repeat. Under any normal circumstances, her body knew the choreography the way a pianist knows scales, without thinking, without effort, without the slightest hesitation. But normal circumstances required a quiet range. This range was not quiet. The first shot she fired went wide. Not by much, a few inches off center, but enough. She reset her stance, controlled her breathing, and tried again. That's when the metal target behind her fell. A training prop catching a gust of wind, swinging and crashing against the steel support with a sound that wasn't quite an explosion but was close enough. Close enough that something inside Rebecca's chest lurched sideways. Her hands hesitated, just for a second. Just long enough for the magazine to go in wrong during the timed reload. She had to pull it, reseat it. And by the time she was ready again, 3 seconds were gone. In marksmanship, 3 seconds is not nothing. Her final score was the lowest in the class. Derek walked past her target on his way back from the line, glanced at it, and said loudly enough for the instructor nearest to them to hear Lawson. Have you ever actually held one of these before today? A few people snickered. Rebecca said nothing. She didn't look at him, didn't look at the instructors, didn't look at the target. She cleared her weapon, checked that it was safe, and stood at parade rest. Master Sergeant Daniel Brooks watched all of this from the far end of the line. He was a compact man, mid-50s, with a face that had spent 3 decades being unreadable. He'd trained hundreds of soldiers. He knew what bad technique looked like. He knew what untrained looked like. He knew what fear looked like. He knew what none of those things looked like, too. And Rebecca Lawson didn't look like any of them. Her stance throughout the qualification was textbook. Her breathing pattern was controlled, even when her hands went wrong. Her weapon handling was automatic, deeply trained, the kind of thing that comes from years of serious repetition. The wear on her equipment wasn't cosmetic. It was operational. The equipment of a soldier who had used it for real. Brooks walked to the end of the line and stared at her score sheet for a long time. Then he wrote something in the corner of his notepad. He wrote, "She is not untrained. She is restrained." He didn't know yet what that meant, but he knew it meant something. The days that followed were, from the outside, a slow disaster. Rebecca failed the room clearing exercise on day 3. She was too slow entering. The instructors counted the seconds out loud while her team waited behind her, and the failure tone sounded while she stood at the threshold, like the doorway was a wall she couldn't see through. "Lawson, you're dead. Your team is dead." Move, she moved. But she'd already lost the scenario. On day 4, she failed the timed hallway clearance. Not because she didn't know the procedure, she knew it perfectly. But midway through the drill, a training charge detonated 2 rooms away, and the sound rolled through the building like a wave. And for about 4 seconds, Rebecca was not standing in a training building in Nevada. She was somewhere else. A different hallway, a different kind of smoke. A radio saying 2 things at the same time, neither of them compatible with survival. 4 seconds. That's all it took. 4 seconds was all the instructors needed to mark the failure. On day 5, she forgot or seemed to forget an instruction given just before a loud drill began. When the noise hit, she turned to her left instead of her right, toward a sound that wasn't part of the scenario, an old sound, one that lived inside her, not in the training building. Dead weight. That's what they started calling her. Not to her face at first, then to her face. She heard it in the mess hall. She heard it on the range. She heard it shouted from across the barracks courtyard, like it was already her name. Derek Shaw was not the one who invented it, but he was the one who kept it alive. He used it with the precision of someone who understood that the right kind of mockery, delivered at the right moment, could become someone's identity before they had a chance to fight back. Dead weight, said with a grin, said in front of instructors, said in the particular way that makes everyone around you laugh, while the target of the joke has to decide in real time whether reacting will make it worse. Rebecca always chose not to react, and in doing so, she gave them nothing. No tears, no anger, no visible shame, just that same flat, quiet expression, those steady eyes that watched everything, and then she would turn away and go back to whatever she was doing. This, somehow, made the mockery worse. Because people who want to diminish you need your reaction to confirm that they succeeded. Without it, they have to try harder. Derek tried harder. At dinner one evening, he sat down across from her uninvited and said, clear as a command, "You know, some people in programs like this get here because commanders feel sorry for them. Take up space that someone more capable could be using." He waited. Rebecca looked up from her tray, looked at him directly, the way a person looks when they've already decided the outcome of a conversation before it begins. Then she looked back down and kept eating. "I'm talking to you," Derek said. "I heard you," Rebecca said. "Then why aren't you answering?" "Because," she said without looking up, "I've found that people who say things like that are mostly looking for an argument, not an answer. And I don't have one to spare tonight." The table went quiet. Derek's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being dismissed without being challenged. An argument he could win, anger he could use, but calm, unhurried disinterest, that was a language he didn't speak. He pushed back from the table and walked away. But Rebecca knew it wasn't over. Men like Derek don't walk away from things. They circle back. She was right about that. She was right about almost everything tactical. Her brain was a machine built for this kind of environment, pattern recognition, threat assessment, spatial awareness, all of it running constantly, automatically, in the background of every moment. The problem was that her brain also couldn't separate the present from the past the way it used to. before the overseas mission, before the explosion, before the radio, that said two things at once. She had been able to compartmentalize with the efficiency of someone who'd been trained to survive by not feeling too much at the wrong time. Now the compartments leaked. Loud sounds leaked them. Overlapping voices leaked them. The specific frequency of radio static that preceded an urgent command that especially leaked them. At night, when the distant training charges detonated on the far range and the sound rolled through the barracks in dull, heavy waves, she lay on her bunk and listened to her own breathing and tried to keep herself inside the present tense. She mostly succeeded. Mostly. But every time she closed her eyes, some part of her walked back into a hallway that smelled like burning concrete and overloaded wiring. She heard voices through a compromised radio. She heard her team leader's voice saying one thing and another officer's voice saying the opposite. And she stood at the center of that impossible geometry and tried to calculate which choice would keep the most people alive. She made a choice. She kept making the same choice every night in the dark of the barracks while the other trainees slept around her. The photograph in her locker kept her company. 5 faces. Her and 4 others. Standing in sunlight somewhere that had a name she didn't say out loud anymore. On the back, in her own handwriting, 4 words. Everyone comes home. The 5th day of the 2nd week, before anyone else was awake, Rebecca went to the empty range. No instructors, no trainees, no explosions, no competing voices. Just the clean, cold Nevada air before the sun came up properly, and the targets standing in their steel rows, and Rebecca Lawson alone with a rifle and her own heartbeat. And she moved, not carefully, not hesitantly. She moved the way water moves continuously, efficiently, without wasted energy. She cleared every position. She hit every target. She reloaded faster than the qualification standard required, transitioned from position to position with a fluid fluency that came from years of doing this in places where a missed shot meant something other than a failing grade. She ran the entire drill sequence in less than half the time the evaluation board required. Then she did it again. Master Sergeant Brooks was watching. He had come in early to review range logs. He'd seen the lights on. He'd walked to the edge of the observation post, fully intending to send whoever it was back to the barracks. Then he saw who it was, and he stood there in the pre-dawn darkness and watched Rebecca Lawson become someone he didn't recognize from any of her evaluation scores. He watched her for 11 minutes. When she finally cleared her weapon and stood down, he stepped back from the observation post so she wouldn't see him. He walked back to his office and sat down behind his desk. He opened her file and stared at it for a long time. Then he opened a fresh page in his notepad and started writing a different kind of notes. Not about performance scores. Not about failure rates. Questions mostly. Who was she? Who had she been? And what exactly had taken that soldier away and hidden her so completely that even she seemed to have forgotten she was still in there? Because the woman he'd just watched on that empty range didn't need training. She needed something he couldn't put in a curriculum. He pulled up the service records that were available to him and read them again. Joint Recovery Unit, Special Operations Attachment, Overseas Evacuation, Rehabilitation, Reassignment. Several pages were restricted. He noted the restriction and wrote something else in his pad. And underneath that, in the quiet of his early morning office, with the Nevada desert going gold outside his window, he wrote the name of a man he hadn't contacted in years. Commander Nathan Cole. SEAL. And somehow connected to everything Rebecca Lawson was carrying. Back in the barracks, Rebecca returned from the range before the morning formation, moving quietly enough that no one stirred. She stood at her locker for a moment, looking at the photograph. She touched the edge of the frame with 2 fingers, just briefly. Then she closed the locker, put on her uniform, and prepared to go fail another evaluation. That's what she believed she was doing. Going to fail. She had started to believe the thing they were calling her. Dead weight. Not in the loud, angry way that takes over a person all at once. In the quieter, more corrosive way where the lie doesn't announce itself, it just starts to feel like memory. Like maybe you were always this. Like maybe the person you were before was the lie, and this the freezing, the hesitation, the way your hands shake when the noise hits a certain pitch. Maybe this is who you actually are when everything else is stripped away. She had spent months being afraid of that possibility. She had requested this assignment because she believed she could outrun it. Prove it wrong. Get through a combat training course and hold the grade in her hand like evidence. 8 red marks. 1 more and the evidence went the other way. She stood in the morning formation with her squad and stared straight ahead and gave nothing away. And Master Sergeant Brooks, standing at the front of that formation, looked at her face and thought about the empty range and the 11 minutes and the way she had moved in the dark like someone who knew exactly what she was doing. He thought about all those red marks. He thought about the difference between a soldier who cannot do something and a soldier who cannot do something yet. He had a feeling, a professional 3-decade feeling, that Rebecca Lawson belonged to the second category. He just didn't know yet what was standing in her way. He didn't know about the hallway and the smoke and the radio that said 2 things at once, and the decision she'd made that had saved 11 people and broken something inside her at the same time. He didn't know about the weight she'd been carrying since then, not from weakness, but from the very particular form of loyalty that makes a person carry the dead alongside the living because setting them down feels like betrayal. He didn't know any of that yet, but he was starting to understand that there was something here he didn't have the full picture of. And Brooks had spent 30 years learning that when you don't have the full picture, the honorable thing, the tactically sound thing, is not to act on the incomplete one. He kept his questions. He kept watching. And 7 days before the end of the course, with Rebecca's career hanging on a single evaluation, he reached out to Commander Nathan Cole. He sent one question, a simple one. He didn't ask the mission. He didn't ask about the commendation. He didn't ask about the pages that were still restricted even to him. He asked, why can a soldier capable of that no longer cross a training doorway? Cole read the message in a conference room in Virginia. He read it twice. Then he closed his laptop, looked at the wall for a moment, and thought about the answer, which was not simple, and which he had been carrying a fair amount of guilt about for longer than he was comfortable admitting. He picked up his phone and booked a flight to Nevada. Rebecca didn't know any of this. She went to dinner that evening, sat in her corner of the mess hall, and ate alone. She could hear Derek and his table laughing about something. She didn't bother to find out what. She finished her food. She went back to her bunk. She took out the photograph and looked at it for a while. Then she put it away and lay in the dark with her eyes open and the distant training charges rolling through the walls, and tried, as she did every night, to stay inside the present tense. She was good at so many things. This keeping herself here in the now out of that hallway, this was the thing she couldn't seem to master. Not yet. She didn't know yet that mastery wasn't exactly what was required. She didn't know yet that sometimes what looks like weakness from the outside is the exact shape of what a person has survived. She didn't know yet that help was already on its way. And she didn't know yet that the 3 words that would change her life were already in the air over Nevada, flying west, in the carry-on luggage of a Navy SEAL commander who owed her a truth she should have had years ago. She just lay there in the dark and waited for morning, and told herself one more time, in the silence of a promise, she wasn't sure she still deserved to keep, that everyone was going to come home. The morning after Brooks sent that message to Commander Cole, nothing felt different on the surface of Fort Granite. The sun came up the same way it always did, hard and without apology. Formation happened at 0600. The instructors called roll in the same flat military cadence. The trainees stood in their lines and stared straight ahead. But underneath the surface, something had shifted. Rebecca could feel it the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm arrives. Not in anything visible, just in the quality of Brooks's attention when he passed her in line. The way he paused 1 beat longer than he needed to before moving to the next soldier. She filed it away. She filed everything away, old habit. The day's assignment was team-based evaluations, and when the squad lists went up on the board, Rebecca stood at the back of the cluster of trainees, pressing forward to read them, waiting until the crowd thinned. Then she stepped forward and found her name, Squad 3. She followed her finger across to the squad leader designation, Lieutenant Derek Shaw. She stood there for a moment with her hand still on the board, not because she was surprised. She had expected something like this. The universe of military training had a particular sense of irony when it came to the composition of squads. But still, she took a slow breath through her nose, the kind of breath that doesn't show, and stepped back from the board. Aaron Pike was behind her. He was watching her face. "You okay?" he asked, quietly enough that the people around them couldn't hear. "Fine," she said. Aaron hesitated. He was the kind of person who wanted to say more and almost never did. She'd noticed that about him in the first few days. He watched things. He thought things. He kept both mostly to himself, orbiting Derek the way a lot of people orbited men like Derek, close enough to absorb the reflected confidence, far enough away that the fallout missed him most of the time. "He's going to make it difficult," Aaron said. "He already is," Rebecca said. "That's not new information." She walked away before he could respond. Derek found her 15 minutes later in the equipment staging area, and he didn't waste any time with preamble. "I'm going to say this once," he said, stepping directly into her space. "You stay at the back. You follow. You do not make independent decisions, and you do not slow us down. If you can manage those three things, we might get through this in one piece. Can you do that?" Rebecca looked at him. She took her time with it, the way she took her time with everything, not out of hesitation, but out of a deliberate refusal to let urgency be imposed on her by someone else's discomfort. "I can do that," she said. Derek blinked. He'd been prepared for argument. "Good," he said. "But before the scenario starts," she added, "you should know that the exercise map shows a secondary entrance at the northeast corner of the structure. It's not marked in the official briefing packet, but it's there. If it's left unprotected, we have a vulnerability from behind." Derek looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the map in his hand. Then he looked back at her with an expression that said, very clearly, that he had already decided she was wrong and didn't need to verify it. "The briefing sheet shows one entry point," he said. "There is no secondary entrance." "The briefing sheet is incomplete," Rebecca said. "Secondary access routes aren't always listed in initial intelligence packages. It's worth verifying." "I'll take that under advisement," he said, in the tone people use when they mean the exact opposite. He walked away. Rebecca watched him go. She thought about pushing it. She thought about going directly to the instructor and flagging the concern. She thought about a dozen things, and in the end, she made the tactical decision that sometimes the most effective thing you can do is let a man prove himself wrong on his own terms and be standing there clearly when he does it. She took her position at the back of the formation. The scenario began at 0900. Derek moved the squad fast. That much you had to give him. The man had a gift for momentum. He hit the primary entrance hard. His voice sharp and clear on the radio. His movements decisive. The first 3 minutes of the operation were genuinely impressive, and Rebecca could see why the instructors rated him highly. He had the kind of command presence that made people want to follow. The problem was that command presence is not the same thing as tactical judgment. They were 60 seconds from the target room when Rebecca saw it. Shadows. Under a door to the left. The secondary entrance she'd flagged during the briefing. The door was supposed to be sealed, and from the official intelligence picture it was. But the gap at the floor told a different story. 2 sets of feet, standing still. "Waiting, Shaw," she said into the radio. "We have contact left flank. Secondary door. 2 role players stationary." "Negative," Derek said. "That door is sealed. Keep moving. The shadow pattern says otherwise. We need to address the left flank before we—" "Lawson, I gave you an order. Stay in position and keep moving." She opened her mouth. And that's when the training charge detonated. It wasn't even close to her. It was in the room ahead of them, part of the scenario timeline, designed to simulate a complication in the target area. Standard procedure. Expected noise. But the sound hit her like a wall she'd walked into in the dark. It wasn't the explosion itself. It was the radio that came alive at the same moment. Multiple voices overlapping, Derek calling a position, an instructor feeding a scenario update, another voice from the role player room calling out the contact. 3 voices, overlapping, each one pulling in a different direction. Rebecca's body stopped moving. Not because she chose to stop, not because she made a decision, because something in her central nervous system that was older and more hardwired than any tactical training she'd ever received simply refused to send the signal forward. She was in a different hallway. Not Nevada, not Fort Granite. A hallway that smelled like burning concrete and fractured drywall, and the particular kind of smoke that comes from a building that has decided it's done standing up. 2 voices on a damaged radio. One telling her to get out. One telling her there were still people alive further in. Her team around her, looking at her, waiting for her decision. She chose. She always chose in the memory. She walked back into it every time. And every time, the noise brought her back to that moment of choosing and the weight of what came after. Sharp. Real. She blinked. She was in Nevada. She was in a training building. And the 2 role players she'd flagged were now stepping through the secondary door she'd warned about. And 2 of her teammates had been marked as casualties because nobody had covered the left flank, because she had frozen. She came back online just fast enough to watch the damage complete itself. "Mission failure," the instructor announced. "Team 3, casualties declared at positions 2 and 4. Stand down." Derek pulled off his helmet and turned to face her. His voice when he spoke was controlled in the way that takes effort. The effort itself was visible. "You froze," he said. "Again." There was a tactical vulnerability on the left. I don't want a briefing, Lawson. I want to know why you freeze every time there's a loud noise. Because that is a problem. That is not a training issue. That is something else. The room had gone very quiet. The other trainees were watching. The instructors were watching. Erin Pike was watching with an expression she didn't have the bandwidth to interpret right now. Rebecca said the secondary entrance was unprotected. That was the immediate cause of the failure. You, Derek said, pointing at her chest, were the immediate cause of the failure. He was right about the mechanics. She couldn't argue that. She didn't say anything else. Brooks was standing at the back of the room. He'd been there the whole time. Rebecca hadn't noticed him, which told her something about the state she'd been in, because she noticed everything usually. She met his eyes for 1 second. He said nothing, but there was something in his expression that wasn't what she expected from an instructor watching a trainee fail. There wasn't frustration there. There wasn't even disappointment. There was something that looked almost like someone working on a puzzle they already suspected they knew the answer to. The debrief afterward was short and brutal. Derek outlined Rebecca's failures in the clinical language of an after-action report, and the instructors listened and made notes. And nobody asked the question that would have mattered, which was, why did the squad leader ignore a specific tactical warning about the left flank before the operation began? Rebecca didn't offer the answer. Brooks asked why. He caught her in the corridor after the debrief, and he didn't lead with pleasantries. He just asked it directly. Why didn't you defend yourself in there? She looked at him. Would it have changed the outcome? It might have given the instructors a more complete picture. The instructors have the picture they need right now, she said. And leaders who spend their time explaining why their teams failed rarely learn the thing that would have prevented the failure. Brooks studied her for a moment. You've commanded people before, he said. Not a question. She didn't answer that directly either. I failed today, she said. That's what's in the record. Right now, he said yes. She walked away and he let her, and he stood in that corridor for a while after she'd gone and turned over her words in his mind. Leaders who spend their time explaining why their teams failed rarely learn the thing that would have prevented the failure. That wasn't the answer of a trainee. That was the answer of someone who had stood where he was standing and watched how the aftermath of failure shapes the people who survive it. He went back to his office and made another note. Captain Rachel Morgan found Rebecca that afternoon. She wasn't looking for trouble or confrontation. She came with a cup of coffee, which already told Rebecca something, because people who come with coffee are usually delivering news they think is going to be hard to receive. Sit down, Rachel said, and sat down herself first, which was also deliberate. Rebecca sat. Rachel was the unit's medical officer, and she had a particular quality of attention that was different from the instructors. She looked at the whole person instead of the performance. She'd been watching Rebecca since the first week, and what she'd seen had produced in her a very specific professional concern. I want to ask you about something, Rachel said, and I need you to understand that this conversation stays here unless you tell me otherwise. All right, Rebecca said. During high-noise environments, you experience what looks like dissociative episodes. Brief, maybe 3 to 5 seconds, then you come back. Rachel paused. That's not inattention, and it's not a training deficiency. That's a trauma response. I think you know that. Rebecca looked at the coffee cup between her hands. The records show you were in rehabilitation for almost 4 months, Rachel continued. After an overseas evacuation, the specific details are restricted, but the timeline is there. The specific details are restricted for a reason, Rebecca said. I'm not asking about the mission. I'm asking about you. Rachel set down her own cup. You've been carrying something that you've decided is a disqualifying condition, and you've been trying to outrun it instead of treating it. Am I wrong? A long silence. Then Rebecca said, You're not wrong. Can you tell me what happened? Another silence, longer. Rachel nodded. She didn't push. Then let me tell you what I can see from the outside. You have exceptional tactical awareness. Your hearing may have been affected. I'm seeing atypical responses to certain sound frequencies, and the overlapping command environment is triggering something. Not weakness, not instability. Something your nervous system is still trying to metabolize. She paused. That's treatable. That's workable. But only if you're willing to let someone help. Rebecca looked up from the coffee. If I accept a diagnosis. I know, Rachel said. You're afraid it becomes the reason they show you the door, doesn't it? Rachel held her gaze. Not if we do this right. Rebecca was quiet again. She turned the cup in her hands. How long have you been watching me? Since your first qualification score, Rachel said. Because your grip was perfect. Your stance was perfect. Your eyes were controlled. and your score was the worst in the class. And those things don't go together unless something else is happening. For the first time in 2 weeks, something in Rebecca's expression moved. Not much. A small shift like a door opening an inch. Then it closed again. I need to think about it, she said. That's fine, Rachel said. She stood, collected her cup. But think about it soon. Because you're almost out of time. She left. Rebecca sat in that room by herself for a while. The sounds of the afternoon drills came through the walls. Voices. Movement. The occasional distant training charge rolling across the range. Every one of those sounds was a small test. She passed some of them. She almost failed others. She got up and went back to duty. What happened next, nobody planned, but everyone remembered. It was day 3 of team evaluations, and Derek had gotten aggressive with his tactics. Not out of strategy, out of something personal. Rebecca's observation about the left flank had been vindicated in a quiet, official way that nobody announced but everyone understood, and Derek had felt it. That particular kind of silence that descends when someone who was dismissed is proven right is louder sometimes than the argument itself. He didn't apologize. Men like Derek rarely do. Instead, he channeled it into something that looked like intensity, but was actually anger wearing a uniform. The scenario was a perimeter clearance. 2 structures, mock civilian presence, role-player hostile contacts placed at classified positions within the exercise area. Derek pushed the squad hard. Too hard. He was moving at a pace that prioritized his sense of control over the actual geometry of the situation. And Rebecca could see from her position at the back of the formation what he couldn't see from the front. The courtyard. 3 windows, open, elevated. No clearance had been called on the surrounding high ground before they entered the exposed crossing. She assessed the angles in about 3 seconds. She said, Shaw. Windows 3 high. Courtyard is not clear. Move, Derek said. The courtyard is not, I said. Move, Lawson. He stepped into the courtyard. The squad followed him. Rebecca did not follow. She stood at the edge of the covered position and watched the window angles and made a calculation. And the calculation took less time than it took Derek to get 4 steps into the crossing. Then she grabbed Aaron Pike by the sleeve of his jacket and pulled him back behind cover. Hard. Fast. No warning. Aaron's shoulder hit the wall and he started to say something, and then the training round struck the ground exactly where he had been standing. The marking system flagged the hit location. A role player on the elevated position called the contact. 3 other trainees in the courtyard were declared casualties. Aaron looked at the mark on the ground, looked at his own feet, looked at Rebecca. She was already back in position, face neutral, like she hadn't just made a split-second calculation that saved him from losing his scenario life, and possibly, in the fraction of a second between her deciding to act and the moment she grabbed him, made something else entirely. Something more than tactical. Something that, in a real operation, would mean the difference between a name on a memorial and a person sitting across from you at dinner. Aaron understood that, even if he couldn't make himself say it right then. Derek turned and saw Rebecca and Aaron at the covered position, and the expression that moved across his face was complicated. Anger was in there. So was something he didn't want to look at too directly. What he said was, "You broke formation." "I pulled Pike out of a marked contact zone," Rebecca said. "I gave you a direct order to advance. Your order would have gotten him killed." Derek took 3 steps toward her. "You are not the squad leader. You follow orders, or you are a liability, and I will have you removed from this team." Rebecca met his eyes. Her voice stayed absolutely level. "You can do that. But you should know that the window clearance was your error, not mine." Derek stared at her for 1 more second, then he turned and pointed at the instructor monitoring the exercise. "She broke that on record." "Noted," the instructor said, and wrote it down. He wrote it next to the notation about the 3 casualties from the courtyard, and next to the notation about the marked strike location, and the 1 trainee who had not been standing in it because Rebecca Lawson had pulled him out of the way 11 seconds before the round arrived. The debrief afterward docked Rebecca's personal score. She had disobeyed a direct order, regardless of the outcome. That was the rule, and the rule existed for reasons, and she didn't argue with it. But Aaron knew. He stood beside her in the debrief and said nothing, and she didn't look at him. And afterward he found her near the water station and said quietly, "Thank you. You don't owe me anything," she said. "I know I don't." He hesitated. "I just wanted you to know I know what you did." "What I did was instinct," she said. "What matters is what you do next time someone around you is making a call that's going to get people hurt." He didn't answer right away. "You mean say something," he said finally. I mean, tell the truth when it's hard and inconvenient, and when the person you have to tell it to is someone with more authority than you. She looked at him directly. That's the moment that defines whether you're actually useful or just present. Aaron carried that with him. She could tell from his face. It had the quality of something landing the way certain words do when they find the exact space they were meant to fill. She didn't say anything else. She went back to her locker, and she looked at the photograph, and she thought about the people in it. All the things they had never gotten to say to each other because there wasn't time, or because they thought there would be more time, or because the building came down before anyone had a chance to decide whether gratitude was a thing that needed to wait for the right moment. It didn't need to wait. It turned out time was not the reliable resource most people assumed it was. She closed the locker. The next morning, Brooks came to find her. He knocked on the doorframe of the equipment bay where she was running maintenance on her gear, and she looked up. He said, "Walk with me," in a tone that wasn't optional. They walked to the far end of the range access road, away from the buildings, where the sound of the bass dropped down to something that was almost quiet. "I've been going through your records," he said. "The restricted portions? The portions that are available to me." He paused. "Joint Recovery Unit attached to Special Operations. Overseas Evacuation Commendation." He stopped walking. One statement in the accessible section from a SEAL commander named Cole, describing you as maintaining command after all senior personnel were incapacitated. Rebecca said nothing. "That's not a support role," Brooks said. "That is not someone who was attached to a unit for administrative functions. That is someone who was running the operation when the people above her went down." She was quiet for a long time. The wind moved across the range. Somewhere far to the north, a training charge detonated, and the sound rolled out flat and low across the desert, and she felt it move through her chest, and she breathed through it, measured and slow, and she stayed in Nevada. This time she stayed. "I sent Nathan Cole a message 2 days ago," Brooks said. She looked at him. "I asked him one question," Brooks continued. "I asked why a soldier capable of what he described cannot currently cross a training doorway." Something moved across Rebecca's face. Not anger. Not quite. Something more like the expression of a person who has been carrying a secret for so long that having it named aloud feels like a physical thing. "You didn't have the authority to contact." "No," he said. "I didn't." He looked at her steadily. "I did it anyway." Another silence. She looked out at the range, the targets standing in their rows, the empty positions and the scrape marks in the dirt from 1,000 iterations of drills. "What did he say?" she asked. "I haven't heard back yet," Brooks said. "But I have a feeling he's going to say more in person than in writing." She turned back to look at him. "He's coming here?" "I don't know that. I'm guessing." Brooks paused. "But I think you know Cole better than the paperwork suggests. And I think you know whether he's the kind of man who would answer a question like that in an email." She thought about Nathan Cole. She thought about the building and the radio and the decision and the 11 people and the 2 who didn't make it home. "No," she said quietly. "He wouldn't answer in an email." They stood there for a moment more. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. Brooks was quiet long enough that the silence had its own weight. Then he said, "Because I've been training soldiers for 30 years. And I know the difference between a person who can't do something and a person who is standing outside their own capability for a reason they haven't been given permission to address." He looked at her with the particular directness of a man who believes in saying the exact thing he means. "And because whatever is in those restricted pages, you are carrying it alone. And that is not a sustainable load, Staff Sergeant." She didn't correct the rank. She hadn't been called that in a long time. She nodded once. They walked back in silence. That evening, Derek Shaw did something unexpected. Not kind, not generous, just unexpected. He came to her after dinner, not in front of anyone, not for an audience, and stood at the edge of the barracks corridor and said, without preamble, "I've been telling people you're unstable." "I know," Rebecca said. "I'm going to keep saying it," he said. "Because I believe it." She waited. But he said, and the word cost him something. She could hear it. "You were right about the windows. The courtyard was an error. Mine." He said it like he was reporting a broken piece of equipment, factually, without embellishment. "I won't say it in the debrief because it doesn't change the score. But I'm saying it now." She looked at him for a moment. "Thank you for that," she said. He nodded, once, the way people nod when they've completed an obligation and aren't sure what to do with the fact that it felt better than they expected. He walked away. Rebecca watched him go and thought that there might be more in Derek Shaw than he'd been willing to show so far. The arrogance was real. The competitive need was real. But underneath it somewhere, there was a soldier who knew the difference between right and wrong, even when choosing wrong was more convenient. That mattered. She didn't know yet how much it was going to matter. In the final room, in the final minutes, with smoke in the air and 3 minutes on the clock, and one member of the squad unaccounted for. She didn't know yet. But she filed it away. She filed everything away. The next morning, the evaluation board posted the updated standings. Rebecca's name sat at the bottom of the list with a new notation: comprehensive final evaluation, 48 hours. Pass or separation from program. Medical review recommended upon dismissal. She read it twice. Then she walked away from the board before anyone could watch her read it twice. In her room, she sat on the edge of her bunk and looked at the floor. She sat there for a while, just breathing, not performing control, just trying to find the actual floor of the thing, the bottom, so she could figure out how far up she needed to climb. 48 hours. She thought about leaving. She thought about packing the bag that was already half packed from the last time she thought about leaving 2 nights ago, and just walking to the transport point and requesting reassignment to something that didn't involve explosions and overlapping voices and the particular kind of public failure that accumulates into identity. She thought about the photograph. She took it out and held it. 5 faces. All of them people who had chosen every time to stay, to go back in, to keep the promise. She put it down on the bunk beside her. Captain Morgan appeared in the doorway. She didn't knock. She just stopped there, reading the situation in the way that people read situations when they have been trained to see what's actually happening instead of what's being performed. "I was hoping you'd already be packed," Rachel said. Rebecca looked up. "Excuse me? If you were already packed, the choice would have been made. Then I wouldn't have to have this conversation." Rachel came into the room and sat down across from her. "But you're not packed. You're sitting here trying to decide, which means there's still something holding you." Rebecca looked at her. Then she looked at the photograph. "I'm going to tell you something," Rachel said, "and I need you to hear it as information, not as motivation. Trauma is not evidence that you're broken. It is evidence that your mind is still trying to survive something your body escaped. The brain doesn't always get the memo that the danger has passed. It stays in emergency mode because emergency mode saved your life once, and it doesn't know when to stop." She paused. "That is not weakness. That is the cost of surviving something that should not have been survivable." Rebecca was very still. "What happened over there?" Rachel asked. Gentle, not pressing, just the question, offered like something she could choose to pick up or leave. And this time, maybe because she was 48 hours from the end, maybe because she was just tired of carrying it entirely alone, Rebecca picked it up. She told her, "Not everything. Not the classified portions, not the names, not the specific coordinates of a building in a country she wasn't supposed to have been in, but the shape of it, the radio with 2 voices giving 2 incompatible orders, the choice she made, the people she saved, the 2 who didn't come back, the secondary explosion that she didn't see coming because she was already moving deeper into the building, because that's what the voice on the radio had told her to do, the ceiling coming down, waking up in a transport vehicle with someone else's blood on her hands and no memory of how she'd gotten there. The commendation she received 3 months later for actions she could only partly remember. The faces she remembered completely. Rachel listened. She didn't write anything down. She didn't nod clinically or interpret in real time. She just listened, the way a person listens when they understand that sometimes the most important medical intervention is simply to create a space where the truth can exist without consequences. When Rebecca stopped talking, the room was quiet. Outside, a training charge detonated on the far range. Both of them heard it. Rebecca's breathing changed for 1 second. Then she regulated it, and she stayed. Rachel said, softly, "You've been blaming yourself for a decision that was made in an impossible situation created by other people's failures. The people who died were my responsibility. You were given 2 contradictory orders by superior officers, and you made the best judgment you could with the information available." Rachel's voice was even and clear. "The deaths were not caused by your decision. They were caused by a failed intelligence assessment, a compromised communication system, and a command structure that put you in an impossible position." She held Rebecca's gaze, "And nobody told you that after, when it was over. Nobody sat down with you and said, clearly and directly, this was not your fault." Rebecca said nothing for a long time. Then, very quietly, she said no. Nobody did. Outside the window, the last light of the Nevada afternoon was going orange and low across the range, and somewhere across the base, a transport vehicle was coming through the main gate, with its headlights already on. Neither of them knew who was in it. Neither of them knew yet that the answer to a question Brooks had sent 2 days ago was arriving in person, with more information than either of them had access to, carrying a truth that Rebecca Lawson should have been given years ago. But the vehicle was there, and the person inside it had come a very long way to say 3 words. Just not tonight. Tonight, Rebecca sat in the quiet room with Rachel Morgan and breathed through the sounds of the range. And for the first time in longer than she could accurately calculate, she told the truth about what she was carrying. And nobody took her credentials or her dignity or her sense of self away from it. They just let it be true. And that was the first crack of light in a very long darkness. He was already inside the base when Rebecca woke up the next morning. She didn't know that yet. She went through her morning routine, the same way she'd gone through every morning at Fort Granite, methodical, quiet, back against the wall while she laced her boots, eyes on the door, out of habit that had long since stopped being conscious. She splashed water on her face and looked at herself in the mirror for exactly as long as it took to confirm that the face looking back was still functional, still present, still capable of going out there and doing what needed to be done. Then she went to formation. Brooks called roll the same way he always did. Flat voice, last names only, the kind of cadence that's been the same in the American military since before any of them were born. The trainees answered in sequence and nobody said anything unusual, and the Nevada morning sat on top of all of them like something patient. Rebecca answered when her name was called. She didn't scan the perimeter of the formation area the way she normally did. She was still processing everything from the night before Rachel's words, the crack in the wall she'd let happen, the strange and terrifying relief of having said the true things out loud in a room where they didn't immediately cost her something. She was still working out how to carry that, whether it made her lighter or just differently weighted. She didn't see the man standing at the back of the observation deck until Brooks dismissed formation, and the group began to move toward the day's first position. Aaron fell into step beside her. "Do you know who that is?" he said, low and sideways, with the careful casualness of someone trying not to look like they're looking. She glanced toward the observation deck, and she stopped walking. Nathan Cole was not a large man, in the way that the most dangerous people rarely are. He was compact, somewhere in his mid-50s, with the kind of stillness that comes from having spent a career in environments where movement draws fire. He wore civilian clothes which, on a base full of uniforms, made him more conspicuous, not less. He had a coffee cup in his hand that he wasn't drinking from. He was watching the formation disperse, with the focused attention of someone conducting an assessment. His eyes found Rebecca. He didn't wave, he didn't nod. He just looked at her for one long second with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize, and then he looked away. "I don't know him," Aaron said, still trying to read her face. "I do," Rebecca said. She kept walking. She went to her position for the morning drill. She performed it. She did not freeze. The training charge that detonated at the 11-minute mark was close enough to rattle the windows, and she felt her chest lock up for 1/2 second, and then she breathed through it the way Rachel had described the night before. Ground yourself in what's physical, what's real, what's here. And she came back inside 3 seconds and kept moving. It wasn't graceful, but she stayed. That was something. Brooks watched the drill from the south end of the range. He watched Rebecca's timing, her positioning, her recovery after the charge. He made notes. When the drill ended and the trainees were standing down, he walked to the observation deck, climbed the stairs, and stood beside Nathan Cole. Cole spoke first. She almost lost it at the 11-minute mark. "Almost," Brooks said. She recovered in under 3 seconds, faster than yesterday. Cole took a sip of the coffee he'd been holding without drinking. "She's been working on it." "She's been working on everything," Brooks said. "Every night before the range opens, she's out there running drills. Alone, she doesn't miss. She doesn't hesitate. She's as good as anyone I've trained in 30 years. He paused. The moment the noise hits a certain level and the commands start overlapping, she goes somewhere else. 3 seconds. 5 seconds. Enough to cost her the scenario every time. Cole looked out at the range. "Did she tell Morgan what happened?" "Some of it last night." "Good." Cole set down the cup. "Then she's ready to hear the rest." Brooks looked at him. "The rest of what?" Cole didn't answer immediately. He watched Rebecca moving across the range in the middle distance, her rifle up, her form precise and controlled, the kind of competence that couldn't be faked because it had been built over too many years in too many real places. "The mission report that got restricted," Cole said finally. "The full investigation findings, the conclusions." He turned to look at Brooks. Nobody gave her those. After it was over, she was decorated, treated, and moved. The system assumed that process was closure. He paused. It wasn't. Brooks was quiet. She's been carrying a version of events, Cole continued, that puts the blame on her decision-making. Because that's the only version she was given. Nobody came back and said, the intelligence was wrong, the communications failed, and two senior officers gave contradictory orders in a crisis situation that should never have been constructed the way it was. His jaw tightened. She saved 11 people after the entire command structure collapsed. And instead of being told that clearly, she was given a commendation and a discharge from rehabilitation and sent back into service. He picked up the cup again. That's on me. I wrote the report. I assumed the official findings would be communicated. They weren't. You're here to tell her, Brooks said. I'm here to tell her, Cole confirmed, and I'm here to observe the final evaluation. Because if there's any part of what I'm seeing in those assessment reports that's being misread, any part of her performance that looks like instability, but is actually something else, I want to be in the room. Brooks nodded slowly. The evaluation is in 48 hours. I know. Cole turned and looked at him directly. Sergeant Major, I have seen Rebecca Lawson maintain command in a burning building with no communications, 2 dead senior officers, and 11 people who needed someone to make a decision. She made the right one, under conditions that would have broken most trained personnel I've worked with. He was quiet for a moment. I need to know whether this program is measuring what she's actually capable of, or whether it's measuring how well she can ignore a wound she never got help treating. Brooks met his eyes. Both questions have the same answer right now, he said. She's 48 hours from being dismissed. Cole nodded once. Then we'd better get started. He found her at midday. He didn't announce himself in advance. He didn't send a message through Brooks or Morgan or anyone else. He just walked to where she was running maintenance on her kit in the equipment bay, alone, and he stopped in the doorway and said, Staff Sergeant Lawson. She looked up, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. It had been more than 2 years since the building and the radio and the decision. And Nathan Cole looked exactly like she remembered him, the same careful stillness, the same eyes that measured everything without appearing to and seeing him here. In this place, standing in a doorway at Fort Granite with Nevada light behind him, produced in Rebecca a reaction she didn't have a clean name for. Not anger, not relief, not fear. Something that contained pieces of all three. Commander, she said, can we talk, he said. She set down the equipment. You flew out here, yes, because of a message from Brooks.
Yes.
She looked at him steadily. What did he ask you? He asked why a soldier capable of what I described in my report can't currently cross a training doorway. Cole came into the room and sat down across from her, not behind a desk or a table, just on a bench with his forearms on his knees at her level. It's a good question. It deserved a better answer than email. It deserved an answer 2 years ago, she said. Yes, he said immediately. It did, and I didn't give it. That's partly why I'm here. She waited. Cole took a breath. After the mission, I filed a comprehensive incident report. The investigation ran for 4 months. Conclusions were reached. He held her gaze. Rebecca. The intelligence assessment that declared the building structurally safe was wrong. The communications protocol failed at the command level. 2 senior officers issued contradictory orders in a crisis window without either of them knowing the other had communicated with your team. He paused. You were given an impossible decision. Not because you were in the wrong position, not because of a failure in your judgment, because the system around you failed first. Rebecca was very still. The people you lost, Cole said, and his voice changed slightly on those words, became quieter and more careful, were not lost because of your decision. They were lost because you were put in a position where any decision you made was going to cost something, and nobody above you should have allowed that to happen. He stopped. The 11 people who made it home, because you kept functioning after the command structure collapsed. That's in the report. That is the conclusion of the official investigation. He looked at her directly, and you should have been told that, clearly, in person, before they pinned the commendation on you and sent you back. His jaw tightened. I assumed the process would deliver that information. It didn't, and I am sorry for that. The room was quiet. Outside, a training charge went off on the far range. The sound came through the walls, and Rebecca felt it move through her chest, and she sat with it for 3 full seconds. And then she breathed out slowly, and she stayed in the room. Cole watched her do it. He didn't look away. You've been working on the response, he said. Trying to, she said. Her voice was controlled, but it was the kind of control that cost something. Morgan is helping. A pause. I should have accepted help a long time ago. Yes, Cole said. But you were given information that made help feel like confirmation of failure. When the story you're carrying says I made the wrong call, accepting treatment becomes accepting blame. He leaned forward slightly. You were not given the true story. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, 11 people, 11 people, he confirmed. I remember carrying one of them, she said. I don't remember how. I don't remember the exit route. I just remember his weight and the smoke and then nothing until the transport. She paused. I've never been able to decide whether or not remembering is better or worse. It means your brain protected you from the worst of it, Cole said. That's not weakness. That's survival. It doesn't feel like survival, she said. It feels like the thing is still happening inside me. Every time the noise hits a certain level, every time I hear 3 voices at once, and they're all giving different directions. She looked at her hands. I go back every time. I know, Cole said. I've read every evaluation report in your file. He paused. And I've watched your morning range sessions on the security footage. She looked up sharply. You're not broken, he said. You are injured. Those are not the same thing. And the evaluation system here has been measuring you as though they're the same thing, which is a problem with the system, not with you. She absorbed that. Then she said, there's a final evaluation in 48 hours. If I fail it, I'm out. I know. Are you going to intervene in the assessment? No, Cole said, not in the assessment itself. You pass or fail on your own performance, he met her eyes. But I'm going to be in the room, and I'm going to make sure that everyone in that room has the complete picture of who they're evaluating. Not just the scores, not just the red marks. He paused. The full picture. She held his gaze for a long time. Then she said, why does it matter to you? Personally. Not the report, not the mission record. Why did you fly here? Cole was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was different. Not the commander's voice. Something below that. Because I wrote a report that called you exceptional, and I never said it to your face, he said. Because the system thanked you in writing, and I let that be enough when it wasn't. Because you saved 11 people in a burning building, and the last thing you deserved was to spend 2 years believing that wasn't enough. He stopped. And because you're one of the best field leaders I've observed in 3 decades of doing this work, and the idea that you might be dismissed from a training program because nobody gave you the truth you needed, that is not something I'm willing to let happen if I can help prevent it. Rebecca looked at him. Something in her face shifted. Not a collapse. Not a breakdown. Something quieter than that. The way a person looks when they've been carrying something so long that having someone else acknowledge its weight, not take it away, just acknowledge it, produces a specific kind of relief that doesn't have a clean name either. Okay, she said finally. Okay, Cole said. I'll do the evaluation, she said. Whatever happens after, I'll do the evaluation. He nodded once. That's all I needed to hear. He stood, started toward the door. She said. He stopped. The 2 people we lost, she said. Reyes and Carver, she said, the names carefully, like objects she was used to handling with precision. Were their families told what actually happened? The real version? Cole turned back. Yes, in the closed-door briefings. But not public, he said. Not publicly. She nodded. I need to write them letters. Yes, Cole said. You do. A pause. I'll help you with that. When this is over. He left. Rebecca sat in the equipment bay for a while after he was gone. She sat with the names Reyes and Carver and let them exist in the room without burying them, without running forward past them, without the specific emotional machinery she'd built to manage their presence in her memory. She just let them be there. It was the hardest thing she'd done at Fort Granite. Harder than the obstacle course. Harder than the rifle qualification. Harder than standing in front of Derek Shaw and his mockery and saying nothing because saying nothing was the right tactical choice. Harder than all of it. She breathed through it. And then she got up and went to find Rachel Morgan. She found her in the medical bay, and she knocked on the open door, and Rachel looked up and saw her face and immediately set down what she was working on. What happened? Rachel said. Cole told me the investigation findings, Rebecca said. The real ones. She came into the room. I need to talk through what he said. I need to hear it in a way that helps me carry it differently. She paused. Can you help me do that? Yes, Rachel said without hesitation. Sit down. That afternoon was by clinical standards a crisis intervention. By the standards of what it felt like to be in the room, it was something Rebecca would later describe to exactly one person as the first time in 2 years that she felt the past begin slightly to become the past. Not disappear, not resolve, not turn into something she had moved beyond, just become the past, not the present. That distinction, Rachel explained, was everything. They worked for 3 hours, not just talking, working. Practical tools for auditory triggers. Breathing techniques designed specifically for the overlap response Rebecca experienced when multiple commands hit simultaneously. Grounding methods she could use inside a scenario without breaking operational continuity. Real techniques, field applicable, not clinical abstractions. By the time they were done, Rebecca was tired in a way that felt different from training exhaustion. Cleaner. The way a room feels different after you've taken everything out of it and put back only what belongs. She went to dinner. She sat at the same corner table. But tonight, Aaron Pike came over and sat across from her without asking whether it was okay, and she let him. "You seem different," he said. "Different how?" Less, he searched for the word. Less braced. Like you've been walking around waiting for the next thing to hit you, and now you're I don't know. Less braced. "I got some information today," she said. "Information I should have had a long time ago." "About the mission overseas?" She looked at him. "You know about that?" "I know there's something," he said. "Nobody knows the specifics. But everyone can see that there's something." He held her gaze. "And everyone who's been calling you dead weight has been wrong. And I should have said that out loud before now, and I didn't, and I'm sorry." She studied him. "Why are you saying it now?" "Because you told me that the moment that defines whether you're useful or just present is when you tell the truth to someone with more authority than you when it's hard and inconvenient." He met her eyes. "You have more authority than me. Not in rank. In every other way that matters." She was quiet for a moment. "You're going to make a good leader someday, Pike," she said. He almost smiled. "Only if I get the chance to finish this program." "You'll finish it," she said. She said it with the certainty of someone who has learned to read people at the level of what they're actually made of, beneath the performance, beneath the fear, beneath the social architecture they build around themselves to survive the environment they're in. She'd read Aaron Pike accurately from the first week. He was good. He just needed to believe it in the right circumstances. She understood that condition better than most people would ever know. 48 hours. The evaluation day arrived the way significant days always do, without announcement, without fanfare, just the ordinary machinery of morning beginning to run. Formation, roll call, the Nevada air. The briefing for the final evaluation ran at 0700. The scenario was a rescue operation inside a mock desert town. 3 structures, a trapped medical team, civilian players, armed, contacts, 30-minute window. Everything that had ever gone wrong in Rebecca's evaluations was in this scenario in some form. Compound structure with multiple entry points, radio traffic with competing voices, flash charges timed to disorient, civilian combatant differentiation under pressure. It was, she understood immediately, designed by someone who had read her complete evaluation file. Whether that was meant to be a final test of her specific vulnerabilities or a genuine operational scenario that happened to include all of them, she couldn't determine. Either way, it was what was in front of her. Derek was appointed squad leader. He stood at the front of the briefing room with his squad, Rebecca, Aaron, and 3 other trainees named Lucas, Torres, and Chen, and he gave a clear, efficient operational overview. Faster than she would have done it. More aggressive in the movement plan, but competent. She couldn't argue with the competence. What she could argue with, and chose not to in the briefing room, was the assessment of risk at the secondary structure. She studied the operational map during the briefing and saw 2 things that weren't flagged in the intelligence packet. An open service door on the east side of Building 2. Fresh movement markers near a hallway that had been designated as cleared in the scenario setup. She noted both. She said nothing at the briefing table. She had learned painfully that the briefing table wasn't always the right venue. But she filed them in the front of her mind where they'd be ready when she needed them. Cole was on the observation deck when they loaded out. Brooks was beside him. Rachel Morgan was there too, which was unusual. Medical officers didn't normally observe final evaluations. But she was there, and Rebecca saw her, and something about her presence helped the way a compass helps. Not by changing where you're going, but by confirming that north is where you think it is. The scenario began at 0930. The first structure went textbook. Derek moved the squad with the efficiencies of someone who had been training for exactly this kind of execution, and Rebecca stayed in position and followed the plan and covered the angles she'd been assigned, and it worked. Clean, fast. 3 minutes under the segment benchmark. She began to think carefully, without letting herself get ahead of the situation, that this might actually work. Then they entered the second structure. Derek moved too fast through the first corridor, too committed to the timeline, and not committed enough to what the ground was telling him. Rebecca saw the service door on the east side, slightly ajar, and called it over the radio. Shaw, service door east, movement noted. Keep moving. He didn't stop. He didn't address the door. 20 seconds later, they hit the staircase. And that's when it all came apart. A flash simulator detonated directly above the staircase. The sound filled the structure from wall to wall, that particular contained explosion that takes up all the air in a building and leaves nothing neutral in its wake. The radio came alive, Derek's voice. Take the stairs, move. An instructor feeding scenario updates, hostile contact, upper level, east corridor. A role player from the adjacent room. We need assistance, southwest position. 3 voices. 3 directions. Rebecca's body went cold. Not all the way, not completely. But the first edge of it hit her, the beginning of the pull back into that other hallway, that other smoke, those other voices, and she felt the ground under her feet become uncertain. The way ground feels when you're not sure it's still Nevada. She closed her eyes for 1 full second. She put her hand against her chest, feeling the photograph through her uniform. She felt the edge of it, the corners of it, the small square weight of it. 4 words on the back that she knew without needing to see them. Everyone comes home. She opened her eyes. The hallway was in Nevada. The smoke was simulated. The voices were her team. She breathed in, breathed out, and then she watched Derek lead the squad onto the stairs. She saw the warning light the same moment he stepped onto the first tread. A red indicator on the structural support, scenario designation unsafe. The stairs were part of the exercise Compromise a Trap, designed to test whether the squad leader would check the structural status board before committing to a route. Derek hadn't checked it. Shaw, she said into the radio. Stairs are flagged. Structural warning. But he was already moving. 3 trainees behind him, committed to the staircase. The instructor's voice came through the radio. Positions 2, 3, and 4 on the stairs. Casualties declared. Structural failure. Half the squad was down. The mission had just become a crisis. That's when Nathan Cole stepped onto the observation platform. He didn't use a back channel. He didn't coordinate with Brooks first. He reached for the radio that was used for direct communication with the squad, the emergency observer channel that existed for safety interventions, and he switched it active. And into the silence of Rebecca's radio, just hers, just the earpiece that fed directly to her right ear, he said 3 words. Lawson, take command, 3 words. She stood very still for 1 second, not because she was freezing, because she was choosing. Nathan Cole hadn't given her a secret code, hadn't performed a miracle, hadn't erased the weight of 2 years in 3 syllables. What he had done was something much more specific and much more important than any of that. He had given her permission to trust the one voice she stopped, trusting after the building came down. Her own. She looked at the structure around her. She looked at Derek, standing on the disabled staircase with 3 simulated casualties behind him and no clear route forward. She looked at Aaron to her left, Lucas to her right, Torres and Chen behind her at the hallway junction. Her hands were not steady. She noticed that. She didn't pretend otherwise, but they were functional. Shaw, she said, get off the stairs. Bring your people back. Derek turned and looked at her. His expression was complicated. Not defiant, something past defiant, something in the territory of a man who has just watched his plan fail and is trying to compute what that means. The stairs are out, she said. I have an alternate route. Get off them. He came down. Rebecca moved. She remembered the service door on the east side. She moved the squad to it fast, checking the sight lines as she went. The structural markers, the door positions, the movement patterns of the role players she could see through the windows. She ran the geometry in her head, the way she'd been running geometry in her head since before Fort Granite, since before the building overseas, since the beginning of who she was as a soldier. Pike, she said, take the rear. Anyone comes through that east junction, I need to know before they get within 10 meters. Copy, Aaron said. He moved. Torres, Chen, cover the role players in the north room. Do not let them cross the threshold until I've cleared the route. They moved. With me. She went to the service door. She pushed it open, checked the angles, went through. The east corridor was clear. She moved the squad through it, methodical and fast, and she called each position over the radio with the specificity of someone who had done this in real buildings, under real smoke with real people, depending on the accuracy of every word. Another flash charge detonated at the far end of the corridor. She felt it hit her chest, felt the edge of the pull. She grounded herself, touched the photograph through her uniform, breathed through it, 2 seconds. She stayed in Nevada. She kept moving. Shaw, she said, I need you on the east casualty position. There are role players designated as wounded in Sector 4. Can you do that? Derek looked at her. There was something in his face she'd never seen there before. Not hostility, not competition. Something quieter than either. Something that might have been, in a different man, in a different moment, the beginning of respect. Yeah, he said, I can do that. She nodded once. Then go. He went. The final room was a problem. 3 role players behind a fortified door, and a direct breach would expose them to simulated fire from 2 elevated positions that Rebecca had flagged but Derek's original plan hadn't accounted for. She stood at the door and thought for approximately 4 seconds. The emergency diagram on the wall showed a maintenance access passage running behind the room from the south side. Not on the operational briefing map, on the emergency diagram. The kind of thing you only know about if you look for it. She'd looked for it. Lucas, she said, you're with me on the south access. Torres Chen, I need a controlled distraction at the main door in 30 seconds. Noise only. No breach. You're drawing their attention. Copy, Chen said. Ready? She said to Lucas. Ready, he said. They went through the access passage in 28 seconds. The role players were secured. The clock showed 4 minutes remaining. Rebecca did the head count, and then she did it again. Where's Pike? Nobody answered. She keyed the radio. Pike. Position static. Aaron respond. Nothing. She looked at the squad around her. Lucas, Torres, Chen, Derek coming from Sector 4 with the simulated casualties. 5 people. The squad was 6. The radio network went down in the east corridor, Derek said. About 90 seconds ago. He looked at her. He stayed back to help Chen when she got disoriented after the second charge. I saw them in the east corridor before the radio dropped. Rebecca looked at the clock. 3 minutes and 40 seconds. The instructor's voice came over the main channel. Primary objective secured. Team 3, you may extract. She did not move toward the exit. Lawson, the instructor said, you have authority to extract. 1 team member is unaccounted for, she said into the radio. We are not extracting. A pause. Staff Sergeant Lawson, and the use of her actual rank was notable, deliberate. She heard it. Your primary objective is complete. Extracting now guarantees a passing score. Derek stepped up beside her. It guarantees a passing score, he said. Quiet, not pressure. Reporting. I heard the instructor, she said. We could fail the whole evaluation if we go back, he said. She looked at him. I know. And you're going back anyway. We are going back, she said. All of us, she met his eyes. You told me he stayed behind to help a teammate. Is that what happened? Derek held her gaze. Then we go back, she said. All of us. And Derek Shaw, who had been calling her dead weight since day 1, who had reported her for breaking formation, who had spent 2 weeks constructing arguments for why she was a liability. Derek Shaw said, copy that, and he followed her back into the building. They went back in. 3 minutes and 32 seconds on the clock. Rebecca moved through the service corridor with Derek on her left and Lucas 3 steps behind, and the smoke simulators that had been running for the last 20 minutes had filled the east wing with the kind of low, rolling haze that turns familiar geometry into guesswork. She couldn't see more than 10 feet in any direction. She could hear the ventilation system cycling, the distant sound of the scenario's ambient audio track crowd noise, structural creaks, the intermittent crackle of radio static that the exercise designers used to replicate the sensory environment of a real operation. She moved anyway. Not because the fear was gone. It wasn't gone. Her chest was tight, and her hands weren't completely steady. And somewhere in the back of her mind, the other hallway was still there, still waiting, the way it always waited when conditions were close enough to that night. But she had learned something in the last 48 hours that she hadn't known before, or maybe she'd known it and just hadn't believed it yet. The fear didn't have to disappear for her to function. It just had to stop being the loudest voice in the room. Right now, the loudest voice in the room was her own, Pike. She spoke into the radio even though she knew the network was down. Old habit, old hope. Aaron, if you can hear me, make noise. Anything, bang something, static. She kept moving. Derek was 2 steps behind her, and she could hear his breathing, controlled, focused, the breathing of a man who had made a decision, and was in it now, fully committed, no reservation. Whatever calculation he'd been running about passing scores and evaluation outcomes had been set aside the moment she said, we go back. She didn't know exactly when or how he'd made that internal shift, but she could hear it in the way he moved. East corridor splits in about 20 meters, she said quietly. Right fork goes back toward the staircase. Left fork dead ends at the maintenance access we used earlier. Pike would have gone right, Derek said. He knows the staircase is out. He's looking for a way to loop back toward the primary extraction. She registered that. He was right. That was a correct tactical read, and the fact that Derek had made it quickly and accurately told her something about what he was actually capable of when the need to perform dominance wasn't taking up half his bandwidth. Right fork, she confirmed. Lucas watched the left side as we passed the junction. If the smoke is moving differently there, it means the ventilation is drawing air from a damaged section. Don't follow it, copy, Lucas said. They reached the junction. She went right. 20 seconds later, she heard it. Rhythmic. Metal on concrete. 2 sharp strikes, a pause, 2 more. A deliberate pattern. Not the ambient track. Not the ventilation system. Someone making noise on purpose. There, Derek said, and she was already moving. Aaron Pike was in a storage alcove off the right corridor, and he was alive and mobile, which were the 2 most important things. And he had a lightweight training barrier across his lower legs that had shifted during the second flash charge and pinned him against the alcove wall. His radio was dark battery connection, knocked loose by the fall, and the smoke in the corridor was thicker here, drawn by an air current from the ventilation duct directly above. He looked up when he heard them coming, and his expression did several things in rapid succession: relief, embarrassment, and the particular quality of gratitude that people try to suppress when they've been trained to believe needing rescue is a failure. I was going to get it off myself, he said. I know, Rebecca said. She was already assessing the barrier. How long has it been on you? Maybe 4 minutes. Radio went out right after it hit. I was trying to, are you hurt? No. It's not heavy enough to do real damage. It's just the angle is wrong. I can't get leverage. She looked at Derek. Left side. I'll take the right. On 3, we lift and tilt. He rolls clear. Derek positioned himself. Ready, 1, 2, 3, they lifted. Aaron rolled. The barrier went to the side, and he was on his feet in 3 seconds, testing his weight, nodding that he was functional. 2 minutes, Lucas said from behind them, checking his watch. Rebecca looked at Aaron. Can you move at pace? Yes. Then move. They ran. Not the controlled tactical movement she'd been using throughout the scenario, actual running, the kind that abandons precision in favor of urgency, because the math of time had shifted, and urgency was now the correct response. She ran with Aaron beside her and Derek ahead, and Lucas behind, and the smoke in the corridor, and the ambient track, and the ventilation noise, and all of it hitting her at once, all the sensory load that had been breaking her down for 2 weeks. And she ran through all of it with her jaw set and her breathing. Deliberate in her mind, doing the one thing it was actually built to do, keeping everyone moving toward the exit. They came out of the structure at a full sprint. The finish line was a painted boundary at the edge of the Mocktown perimeter, and they crossed it in a group, not in a clean formation, not with military precision, just together, all 4 of them at the same moment, with seconds to spare. The success tone sounded across the facility. A single sustained note, clean and unambiguous, and it hit Rebecca in the chest with a force that was entirely disproportionate to its volume. She stopped running. She stood at the finish line with her hands on her knees and her chest working hard, and she listened to that sound and let it be real. Beside her, Aaron said nothing. He put his hand briefly on her shoulder, 1 second firm, and then gone, and that was enough. Lucas exhaled loudly and said, come on, to nobody in particular, just to the air, just because the tension had to go somewhere. Derek stood a few feet away. He had his hands at his sides, and he was looking at the building they'd just come out of, and his expression was something she'd never seen on his face before. Not triumph. Something quieter than triumph. Something that looked like a man beginning to understand the difference between the things he'd been measuring himself by and the things that actually mattered. He didn't say anything, but he didn't walk away from the group either. On the observation deck, Nathan Cole set down the radio he'd been holding since the moment he'd spoken into it. Brooks was beside him, and Rachel Morgan was on his other side, and all 3 of them had watched the last 3 minutes in a silence that had its own particular texture, the silence of people who have been holding their breath but deciding to. She went back, Brooks said. She always goes back, Cole said. That was never the question. Rachel was watching Rebecca at the finish line. The question was whether she'd let herself, she said. Cole looked at her. Yes, he said quietly. That's exactly right. The evaluation room convened 45 minutes later. Rebecca sat on one side of the table. Brooks and 2 senior instructors sat on the other. Cole sat at the end, observers, which technically meant he wasn't part of the decision-making structure, but practically meant that his presence shaped the temperature of the room. The lead instructor, a lieutenant colonel named Hartman, who had been running these evaluations for 7 years, opened with the standard framework: objective casualty count, time, metrics, deviation from the operational plan, Rebecca sat and listened and kept her face neutral. Primary objective, Hartman said, secured. All role players extracted, he made a mark. Casualty count among trainee personnel 0 at extraction. The 3 trainees marked during the staircase failure were recovered and brought to the finish line within the scenario parameters. He looked up. Trainee Pike, pinned in East Corridor, confirmed, recovered, and extracted. Another mark. Time to finish, 27 minutes and 48 seconds. Under the 30-minute benchmark, he set down his pen. This evaluation would be straightforward, he said, except that the operational plan deviated significantly from the assigned structure in the final 12 minutes. The squad leader, he glanced at his notes. Lieutenant Shaw initiated the staircase movement that led to the 3 declared casualties. Command was subsequently transferred to Staff Sergeant Lawson. He looked at Rebecca directly. Without formal authorization from this evaluation board, she met his gaze. Commander Cole authorized the command transfer. Hartman looked at Cole. Cole said, I used the Observer Emergency Channel to issue a direct command. Staff Sergeant Lawson responded to that command appropriately and effectively. The Observer Channel is a safety intervention protocol, Hartman said, not a command authority channel. I'm aware of that, Cole said. I made a judgment call. The scenario was deteriorating. Half the squad was down, and I made an assessment that the correct intervention was a direct command to the most qualified person on the ground. He held Hartman's gaze steadily. I stand by that call. Hartman looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked back at his notes. Nonetheless, he said, the record shows repeated failures over the course of this evaluation period. 8 prior failed scenarios. A pattern of hesitation under high noise conditions. A behavioral profile that has been assessed by multiple instructors as indicative of a significant operational liability. The behavioral profile, Rachel Morgan said, from her seat at the side of the room, has been misread. Hartman looked at her. Captain Morgan. The hesitation under high noise conditions that this program has been documenting as a training deficiency is a trauma response, Rachel said in the flat, precise voice of someone delivering clinical findings. Specifically, an auditory-triggered dissociative episode consistent with post-traumatic stress in a soldier with known combat exposure and unremediated psychological injury. It is a wound. She paused. And the evaluation framework used by this program does not currently distinguish between those 2 things, which means that for the last 2 weeks, this program has been measuring Staff Sergeant Lawson's injury and calling it her character. The room was quiet. Hartman looked at Brooks. Brooks, she's right. And that's a problem with the program, not with the soldier. The first twist nobody in that room had been prepared for came next. Hartman set down his pen and folded his hands on the table and said, Sergeant Major Brooks, are you telling me that this program's evaluation methodology has a systemic deficiency? I'm telling you, Brooks said, that we measure speed and aggression with more precision than we measure judgment awareness or the ability to function under psychological load, and that those are not the same things, and that the most consequential operational environments require all of them. He paused. I've been training soldiers for 30 years. The best ones I've seen aren't the fastest. They're the ones who keep thinking clearly when everything around them is trying to stop them. He looked at Rebecca. That is what I watched today. Hartman was quiet for a while. Then he looked at Rebecca directly. Staff Sergeant Lawson, I'm going to ask you a question, and I want a direct answer. All right, she said. If you are returned to this program with accommodations, modified radio protocols, adjusted evaluation criteria, continued treatment through Captain Morgan, can you complete this course? She held his gaze. Yes. Can you function operationally? Not in this building. In the field. She took a breath. With the right support structure and continued treatment. Yes, I believe I can, she paused. But I want to be honest with you. I am not the same soldier I was before the overseas mission. I don't think I will be, exactly. What I can tell you is that what I've learned from what happened to me has made me a better leader in the ways that actually matter. Not faster, better. Hartman looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at his notes, then at Cole, then at Brooks. He picked up his pen. The dismissal recommendation, he said, is withdrawn. Rebecca's hands, folded on the table in front of her, went very slightly still. Not a visible reaction. Just a microscopic pause. The kind of pause that happens when something you've been braced against doesn't arrive. The evaluation board will convene with Captain Morgan to develop a modified program structure. Hartman continued. Accommodation is not exemption, the standard remains the standard. But the pathway to demonstrating that standard will be adjusted to account for the documented condition. He looked up. Additionally, the board will conduct a review of current evaluation methodology. Sergeant Major Brooks's concerns about what we measure and how we measure it are legitimate and will be addressed formally. Dismissed, he said. She stood. She collected her materials. She walked to the door. Staff Sergeant Hartman said. She stopped. Today's evaluation, he said. The final decision to return for trainee Pike, going back when you had a passing score available to you. He paused. That was leadership. That was the kind of decision that the evaluation system here doesn't have a metric for. A pause. It should. She nodded once. She walked out. In the corridor, she stood for a moment with her back against the wall and her eyes on the ceiling, and she took 3 slow breaths. Not because she was falling apart, because she needed the 3 seconds between what had just happened and the rest of the day, and she was learning finally, tentatively, at significant personal cost, that taking 3 seconds when you need them is not weakness. It's the opposite of weakness. Cole found her there. He came out of the evaluation room 2 minutes after she did, and he stood beside her in the corridor and didn't try to fill the silence with something manufactured. Eventually she said, "Thank you." "For what specifically?" he said. "For coming here," she said. "For the channel." For the 3 words. She looked at him. "For what you said in the equipment bay." "I should have said it 2 years ago," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "But you said it now." She looked back at the ceiling for a moment. "That matters." Cole was quiet. Then he said, "What are you going to do?" "With the 2 options they're going to offer you, complete the program or transfer to instruction." She thought about it. She thought about it honestly, without the reflexive need to choose the option that looked like she was proving something. "I don't know yet," she said. "I need to think about it without the 48-hour countdown in my head." "That seems reasonable," Cole said. "I need to write the letters first," she said, "to Reyes and Carver's families, before I decide anything else." He nodded. "We'll do that this week." She looked at him. You write them," he said. "I'll make sure they get delivered through the right channels, with the full truth attached." He held her gaze. "They deserve that too." She had to look away for a second. "All right," she said. The afternoon moved in the strange slow-motion quality of days after significant things. The other trainees came back from their own debriefs and found the squad gathered in the equipment bay, and the atmosphere was different from anything that had characterized the 2 weeks preceding it. Not celebratory. More like the aftermath of a storm when the noise has stopped and everyone is checking themselves for damage and realizing, with a kind of subdued surprise, that they're still standing. Aaron was the first one to say anything that mattered. He stood in the center of the equipment bay with his hands in his pockets, and he looked at the group, at Rebecca and Derek and Lucas and Torres and Chen, and he said, "I need to say something to everyone here." The room went quiet in the particular way. Rooms go quiet when someone is clearly about to say something real. "During the courtyard exercise 4 days ago," Aaron said, "Lawson pulled me out of a marked contact position. I would have been declared a casualty. She took a hit to her own evaluation score to do it." He looked at Rebecca, and I didn't say anything, because I was afraid of what Shaw would think. He looked at Derek, and that was wrong. And it affected how other people in this class treated her, because I let a lie by omission go on when I should have corrected it. He looked back at the group. "She's not dead weight. She's never been dead weight. And I'm sorry I let that stand." Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Lucas said, "Same. I laughed at that nickname the first day I heard it. I didn't know her. I went along with it." He shook his head. "That was cheap of me." Derek stood at the far edge of the group with his arms crossed, and he looked like a man in the middle of an uncomfortable internal argument. He had the expression of someone who knows exactly what they're supposed to say and is fighting the part of themselves that makes honesty feel like defeat. He worked it out. "What I said about some soldiers being here. Because commanders feel sorry for them," he said. He looked at Rebecca directly. "That was about you. I said it to establish something at your expense." He paused. "It was wrong and cheap." Like Lucas said, his jaw tightened. "I judged you by your worst moments. Publicly. Repeatedly." The room was very still. "I'm not going to pretend the last 2 weeks didn't happen," he said. "But I want to say clearly that what I saw today, the source quarter, the maintenance access. Pike, I have never seen anyone lead a situation like that under those conditions." He met her eyes. "I was wrong about you." Rebecca looked at him for a moment. "Knowing you're wrong is the first step," she said. "Saying it in a room full of people is the second." She held his gaze. "The third is making sure you don't do the same thing to the next person who shows up somewhere differently than you expected." He held her gaze. "Fair. Why did you come for Pike?" Torres asked. She'd been quiet through all of it, watching, processing. And now she asked the question that was in the room. You had a passing score. You could have extracted. Why did you go back? Rebecca looked at her. She thought about how to answer it, not the tactical answer, not the leadership principle answer, but the true one. Because a passing score means nothing, she said. If the people on your team know you walked away from them when it was inconvenient to come back. She paused. And because the promise I made to myself a long time ago wasn't about scores. Torres nodded slowly. Everyone comes home, Aaron said quietly. He'd read the back of the photograph at some point, she didn't know when. Didn't ask. It didn't matter. Everyone comes home, Rebecca confirmed. That evening, Brooks came to find her. He knocked on the equipment bay doorframe the way he always did, one knock, flat, functional, and she looked up and he said, "Walk with me," in the same tone he'd used before, the one that wasn't optional. They walked the range access road in the dark, the Nevada night dry and cold above them, the distant lights of the base, making the sky a particular shade of gray at the edges. The board is going to formalize 2 tracks, Brooks said. Modified continuation of the program or transfer to the Tactical Leadership School in Virginia as an instructor. He walked in silence for a moment. What are you leaning toward? Instruction, she said. He nodded like he'd expected that. Because? She thought about it. Because I spent 2 weeks failing a program that was measuring the wrong things. And I want to spend time making sure fewer people fall through the same gap. She paused. And because I'm not ready to go back to high-intensity operations yet. I know that. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. She looked at him. I used to think admitting that was the same as giving up. I don't think that anymore. Brooks was quiet for a while. The module you'd build, he said. The communication stuff. The trauma response work. The clear command hierarchy under pressure. That could become something real. I know, she said. I'll help you, he said simply. Like it wasn't a significant offer. I know that too, she said. They walked in silence for a bit. Then Brooks said, I've been doing this for 30 years, and I have not always asked the right questions first. He stopped walking. When you came in with those red marks, I looked at the scores before I looked at the soldier. I should have looked at the soldier first. She stopped beside him. You looked eventually. Eventually, he agreed. That's a low bar. You sent Cole the message, she said. You didn't have the authority and you did it anyway because you thought I needed something the official process wasn't going to give me. She held his gaze. That's not a low bar. That's someone doing the right thing at personal cost. She paused. I've been in rooms with people who didn't do that when they could have. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, You're going to be a remarkable instructor. I'm going to be a work in progress, she said, which is more useful. He almost smiled. Same thing in my experience. They walked back. 2 days later, Derek Shaw did something nobody on the squad expected. He came to Rebecca's bunk before morning formation, before the base was fully awake, and he stood in the doorway with something in his hand. He held it out. It was the squad patch from the final evaluation. The one they'd all worn on their left shoulders for the scenario, the temporary designation that the evaluation board issued for each exercise, meant to be returned at the end of the session. He had kept his on the back. He had written 4 words. No one left behind. Rebecca looked at it. She looked at the words. She looked at him. I kept the evaluation copy, he said, with the tone of a man who is aware that what he's doing is sentimental and has decided to do it anyway. I know technically it should have gone back to the board. A pause. I'll report myself for the infraction if you want. She took the patch from him. She turned it over and read the back again. No one left behind, she said. It seemed like the right 4 words, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Derek Shaw, who had been the first and loudest voice in the campaign to define her by her worst moments, who had stood in front of instructors and called her a liability and a deadweight and a soldier, who was only there because someone felt sorry for her, who had been, for 2 weeks, the embodiment of every institutional obstacle that gets placed in front of people who are struggling in ways that aren't immediately legible to the system evaluating them, and who had, when it mattered, come back into a building with her, who had given her Aaron's exact position, the open exit, the time remaining clear information, clearly delivered, no competition in it, nothing personal, just the facts she needed to do what she was already doing, who had followed her into the smoke. You could have led today, she said, if you'd checked the structural board, if you'd addressed the service door before the scenario started. She held his gaze. You have the talent. You need to learn that speed without awareness is just movement. He accepted that without defending himself. That was new. I know, he said. Work on it, she said. You're going to be somebody's team leader someday, and they're going to need you to check the structural board. I will, he said. She placed the patch in her locker next to the photograph. The two things sat side by side. The photograph with 4 words in her handwriting on the back. The patch with 4 words in Derek's. Everyone comes home. No one left behind. The same promise. 2 different languages. The same weight. She stood there and looked at them for a moment. Then she closed the locker and went to formation. The week that followed was different from any week that had come before it. The modified program structure went into effect with the specific adjustments Rachel had recommended: a clear communication hierarchy on the radio, sequential command delivery instead of simultaneous, flash charge deployment with a brief audio precursor that gave trainees a 1-second preparation window. These weren't coddling measures. They were the elimination of artificial chaos that had nothing to do with the actual skills being evaluated. The results were immediate and notable, not just for Rebecca, for the entire class. When the radio command hierarchy was clarified and the overlapping simultaneous directives were replaced with sequenced information, the class average on scenario completion improved by 19% in the first week. Torres, who had been struggling with similar dissociation episodes that she'd been hiding behind manufactured confidence, came forward to Rachel after seeing Rebecca's accommodation and was diagnosed with her own unaddressed stress injury. Chen, who had been dismissed by most of the instructors as a slow processor, turned out to have a documented auditory processing difference that had never been accommodated in any training environment he'd been through. The accommodation, it turned out, hadn't leveled the playing field for one person. It had revealed that the playing field had never been level to begin with. Brooks presented these findings to the evaluation board at the end of the week. He stood in front of Hartman and the 2 senior instructors, and he walked through the numbers with the quiet precision of a man who has been waiting 30 years to say something and has finally found the data to support it. Hartman listened. When Brooks finished, Hartman was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "What do you need to formalize these changes?" And that was the moment the program began to change. Rebecca sat in Rachel's office on the last night before the modified program segment began, and they talked for a long time about what was ahead. The letters to Reyes and Carver's families, which she'd drafted 3 times in the last 4 days, and wasn't satisfied with any of the versions. The decision she'd already made about instruction. The question of what full recovery looked like, not as a finish line, because Rachel had been honest with her that it wasn't a finish line, but as a direction, a continuing orientation. "What are you most afraid of?" Rachel asked. Not clinically, just asking. Rebecca thought about it honestly. Going back to high-intensity operations and freezing at a moment that costs someone their life, she said. And the instruction role doesn't carry that risk. It carries a different version of it, Rebecca said. If I teach it wrong, if I miss something, if I send someone into a situation they're not ready for, because I didn't see what they were actually carrying. She paused. But that's a risk I can manage better. That's a risk I can see clearly enough to navigate. Rachel nodded. That's a realistic assessment. I'm working on those, Rebecca said. Rachel smiled at that. The first real uncomplicated smile Rebecca had seen on her face, which told her something about how tense the last 2 weeks had been for everyone in that building. You're going to be fine, Rachel said. I'm going to be a work in progress, Rebecca said. I know, I said what I said. Rebecca left the medical bay and walked back across the dark base to the barracks. The Nevada night was cold and clear, and the stars above Fort Granite were the particular density of stars you only get far enough from city light. Thousands of them, the full sky without dilution. She walked slowly, not because her knee was bothering her, just because she let herself. She thought about Reyes. She thought about Carver. She let them be real in her mind, without the machinery of suppression, engaging the way it usually did. Just let them be there, the way people you've lost are allowed to be there, not as wounds, but as presences. People who were, people who mattered, people whose absence was real and allowed to be real without that reality becoming the only thing she could feel. She thought about 11 people who had made it home. She thought about Aaron Pike, pulled out of a marked contact zone on day 3, and too afraid to say anything about it until he wasn't afraid anymore. She thought about Lucas, who had laughed at a nickname and then been honest about it in a room full of people. She thought about Torres and her hidden injury. She thought about Derek Shaw, standing in a doorway before morning formation, holding a patch with 4 words on the back. She thought about Brooks, who had looked at her record and seen a contradiction and sent a message he didn't have the authority to send. She thought about Nathan Cole, flying to Nevada to say in person what should have been said years ago. She thought about Rachel Morgan, who had come with a cup of coffee and sat down and listened until the true things had somewhere to go. She stopped walking. She stood in the middle of the base road and looked up at the stars for a moment. Just a moment. Long enough to let it settle, all of it. Everything that had happened in 2 weeks. Everything that had changed and everything that hadn't. The red marks and the 3 words in the photograph and the patch and the letters not yet written and the classroom not yet filled. Long enough to understand that this was not the end of something. It was the first morning of something else. She put her hands in her pockets. She walked back to the barracks. She opened her locker and looked at the photograph and the patch sitting side by side, and she left them both there and closed the locker and got into her bunk. She did not lie awake, listening to the training charges roll across the range. She slept. She slept through the night for the first time in 2 years. Not perfectly, not without interruption. Sometime around 3 in the morning, a training charge detonated on the far range, a night exercise for a different unit, distant enough that it rolled through the walls as a low, slow vibration rather than a sharp impact, and she felt it, and her chest tightened for 1 second, and then she breathed through it and went back to sleep. 3 seconds. She was getting better at 3 seconds. In the morning, she wrote the letters. She had drafted them 4 times already and thrown each version away, because each version was trying to accomplish too many things at once. Explain, justify, grieve, apologize, honor. She finally sat down in the early dark of the barracks before anyone else was awake, and she wrote 2 letters that did only one thing each. She told each family the truth, not the official version, not the commendation language, the actual truth, in her own words, about who their person had been inside that building, what they had done, and what she carried forward from knowing them. She wrote Reyes's letter first. Reyes had been 24 years old and had a habit of humming under his breath during equipment checks. And she put that in the letter because it was true, and because his family probably knew it, and because the details that feel too small to mention are often the ones that prove to a grieving person that someone else actually saw their person clearly. She wrote Carver's letter second. Carver had been 31, the steadiest presence in any room she'd ever put him in, and she told his family that when the building came down, he had been doing exactly what he was trained to do, and exactly what he chose to do, and that those 2 things had been the same thing his entire career. She sealed both envelopes. Cole had said he'd handle delivery through the right channels. She left both letters in his care when she saw him at breakfast, passing them across without ceremony, just handing him the envelopes and holding his eyes for a moment and then letting go. He took them carefully. "I'll make sure they get there," he said. "With the full truth," she said. "With the full truth," he confirmed. She nodded and picked up her tray and walked to her table. Aaron was there. He slid over without being asked. The modified program segment ran for 3 more weeks. The changes Brooks had pushed through weren't dramatic in isolation: a cleaner radio hierarchy, sequence commands, adjusted evaluation criteria that weighted judgment and adaptability alongside speed, but in practice they changed the character of every exercise. The scenarios didn't get easier. If anything, they got harder, because the artificial chaos that had been masking genuine skill deficiencies in some trainees was removed. And what was left underneath was the actual question: can you think clearly under real pressure? Rebecca thrived in that environment. Not because the trauma response disappeared. It didn't. There were still moments of flash charge at close range, a specific frequency of radio static, the overlap of 2 commanding voices at the same instant when she felt the pull, felt the edge of that other hallway beginning to assert itself over the Nevada training building she was standing in. But she had tools now. She had Rachel's breathing techniques and grounding methods, and the practical framework of knowing that the fear was a wound's response, not a verdict. She had 3 seconds. She had learned what 3 seconds was worth. And she had the photograph. She touched it sometimes through her uniform when the noise was loudest, and it wasn't a superstition or a ritual. It was a compass, a direction. Everyone comes home. She had made that promise to people who weren't here anymore, and keeping it for the people who still were was the most honest way she knew to honor them. The class watched her change. Not overnight. Not with the kind of dramatic transformation that happens in movies, where a single moment rewrites a person completely and everything after is clean and resolved. Real change doesn't work like that, and the trainees at Fort Granite were soldiers, trained observers, and they would have seen through a performance of recovery the same way they'd eventually seen through the performance of her suppression. What they saw was gradual and real, a woman who was still navigating something difficult, who sometimes needed an extra breath before she moved, who occasionally asked for a command to be repeated before she acted on it, and who, within those real and honest limits, led better than anyone else in the class. She took point in scenarios she wasn't assigned to lead. Not out of ego, she would step back immediately and give the role to whoever had the designation, but because she had the habit of seeing things first. And once she'd stopped hiding that habit, it was useful to everyone. She flagged 3 tactical vulnerabilities in the final week of exercises that the instructors confirmed were genuine and would have caused casualties in a real environment. She developed a system for clearing multi-level structures in low-visibility conditions that Brooks called the most practically innovative approach he'd seen in 6 years of running these evaluations. She wrote it out by hand and gave it to him without naming it or putting her name on it, and he put her name on it himself before he filed it. She still wasn't the fastest. She still wasn't the loudest. She was not the soldier who looked most like a soldier in the way that action movies have trained people to imagine soldiers look. She was methodical and quiet, and occasionally needed 3 seconds, when the noise was right and everything was firing at once. But she was the one you wanted making the call in the last room, with smoke in the air and the clock running down and one person unaccounted for. Every member of the class knew that now. Even Derek, especially Derek. He graduated 2 weeks after Rebecca transitioned out of the modified program segment and into her formal acceptance of the instruction track. His final evaluation score placed him 4th in the class, not the first he'd been aiming for since day 1, but a number that reflected genuine competence and, in the final 3 weeks, a notable shift in the quality of his decision-making under pressure. His evaluation report used 3 words that Brooks had specifically requested be included: capable, determined, and still learning. Derek had read those words, standing at the evaluation board, and then stood there for a long enough moment that the trainee behind him had to say, "Excuse me," to get past. He didn't resent the still learning. That was the change. That was what 2 weeks at Fort Granite with Rebecca Lawson had actually done to Derek Shaw. Not humiliated him, not dismantled him, not reduced him to someone smaller than he'd been when he arrived. It had given him a more accurate map, a better understanding of where he actually was, relative to where he thought he was, and what the distance between those 2 points required from him. He sought her out on his last day. She was in the equipment bay, because she was usually in the equipment bay at the end of the day, cataloging and organizing and doing the maintenance work that she'd always done with the kind of deliberate care that suggested it was less about the equipment and more about needing something to put her hands on while her mind processed the rest. He knocked on the doorframe. She looked up. "Graduated," he said. "Congratulations," she said. He came into the room. He stood there for a moment, working out how to start, and she recognized the expression she'd seen it on him twice before, both times when he'd been about to say something honest at personal cost. "I came to ask you something," he said. "All right. Why did you trust me in the final scenario?" he said. "When you went back for Pike, you put me on the East casualty position. You gave me a role instead of benching me. Why?" She set down what she was working on and thought about it. Not performing thought, actually thinking about it, the way she did when someone asked a question that deserved a real answer. "Because you told me the truth about the courtyard exercise," she said. "The window clearance. You came to me privately and said it was your error, and you didn't have to do that. Nobody asked you to." She met his gaze. "You did it because it was right. Not because it was convenient or because it served you. Just because it was right." She paused. "A person who can do that is a person I can work with, even if we've been in conflict. Because I know that when it matters, they'll tell me the truth." Derek held her gaze for a long moment. "I wasn't going to come back for it," he said. "In the scenario, when you said we're going back for Pike, my first thought was that we'd fail the whole evaluation. My second thought," he said, "was that I didn't want to be the person who didn't go back." He paused. "I'm not sure I would have made that call on my own. I'm not sure yet." He looked at her steadily. "I think I need to know that about myself before I'm running a real team." "Yes," she said, "you do." "How do you figure that out?" She considered. "You pay attention to the decisions you make when nobody's watching and there's no consequence either way. Those are the ones that tell you who you actually are." She paused. "And you put yourself in situations where the right call is harder than the easy call, repeatedly, until the right call becomes reflex." He nodded slowly. "Is that what the instruction role is for you?" he asked. "Building those reflexes in other people?" She looked at him. It was a perceptive question. More perceptive than she would have expected from him 2 weeks ago. "Partly," she said. "And partly it's because I almost missed the fact that I still had something to give." I was so focused on what I'd lost that I couldn't see what was left. She looked at her hands for a moment. That's a lesson worth passing on. Derek reached into his pocket and took out something small and offered it across to her. She looked at it. A ranger coin, the kind that gets passed between soldiers at moments that don't have official designations but have weight anyway. She took it. No one left behind, he said. No one left behind, she confirmed. He left Fort Granite 2 hours later. She watched the transport take him through the gate from the observation deck, and she felt something that wasn't quite fondness, but was adjacent to it. The particular quality of feeling you have for someone who made your life significantly harder, and, in doing so, made you significantly better. Not because difficulty makes people better automatically, but because Derek Shaw had been the friction against which she had finally, after 2 years, remembered who she was. She went inside and packed her own things. The Joint Tactical Leadership School in Virginia was 6 weeks away. In those 6 weeks, she did 3 things. She completed the modified program segment at Fort Granite, passing every remaining evaluation with scores that placed her in the top third of the class. Not first. She didn't need first. She needed to know she could do it, and now she knew, and that was sufficient. She worked with Rachel Morgan twice a week in sessions that were less therapy and more practical engineering, developing specific, field-applicable tools for managing the auditory trigger response that she could use in instruction environments and eventually, gradually, potentially in operational ones. Rachel was careful not to make promises about timeline. Rebecca was careful not to demand them. They worked in the space of what was actually possible, and what was actually possible kept expanding by increments that felt small individually and significant in accumulation. And she built the framework for the module she'd been thinking about since the final evaluation. She worked on it in the evenings, after training, sitting at a desk in the barracks with Brooks's navigation logs and Rachel's clinical frameworks, and her own 2+ years of experience living inside the problem she was trying to solve. She called it Clear Voice Protocol. The name came from the things she'd learned that no training document had ever told her directly. In a crisis, the most dangerous thing is not the threat in front of you. It is the moment when the voice is giving you information. Stop being distinguishable from each other. When you can't hear which one to trust. Clear Voice Protocol was about building the communication structures that prevented that moment from occurring. It was about how leaders delivered information under pressure, how teams established signal hierarchies before crisis rather than during it, how you identified and accommodated the different ways people processed information under load, and how you distinguished between hesitation that was a warning sign and hesitation that was a warning, the kind that came from experienced pattern recognition and deserved to be heard. It was the module she wished had existed when she was 26 and standing in a building with a compromised radio and 2 voices saying opposite things. It was going to protect people she hadn't met yet. That thought was the one that kept her at the desk when she was tired. Brooks read the full framework on a Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks before she left Fort Granite. He sat across from her in his office and read it cover to cover without speaking, and she sat across from him and watched the Nevada light move through the window and didn't try to fill the silence. When he finished, he set it down. He looked at her for a moment. "This is going to save lives," he said. She didn't deflect it. She didn't minimize it or qualify it. She had been practicing, with Rachel's help, the specific act of receiving true things without immediately finding reasons they weren't true. "That's the intention," she said. "I'm going to use portions of it here," he said, "with attribution. And I want to co-author the formal submission if you're willing, because it'll move faster through the military education system with my name attached. And that matters more than who gets the credit." She looked at him. "You want to put your name on it to make it move faster?" "Yes," he said. "Is that all right?" "More than all right," she said. He nodded, made a note. Then he looked up and said, "I owe you something." She waited. "When you arrived here," he said, "I watched your first qualification, and I saw the contradiction, the perfect form, the worst score, and I wrote in my notes that you were restrained, not untrained. I was right about that." He paused. "But I also let 2 weeks happen to you before I did anything meaningful about it. I watched the mockery and the red marks, and I told myself I was gathering evidence, trying to understand the full picture." He held her gaze. "That was partly true. It was also partly that I didn't act quickly enough, and you paid the price for that." She was quiet for a moment. "You acted," she said finally. "You sent Cole the message. You pushed back in the evaluation room. You're reforming the assessment methodology." She paused. "People learn at different speeds. The important thing is they learn. He almost smiled. Where did I hear that before? Somewhere, she said. Sounds like something someone wise said. It does, he agreed. She left Fort Granite on a Tuesday morning in October. The air was different that day, slightly cooler, the desert summer finally releasing its hold, and she walked to the transport vehicle, with her bag on one shoulder, and her movements careful but unhurried. Her knee was fine. Her hands were steady. The transport vehicle made a mechanical sound as it idled, a rhythmic thudding, and she felt it in her chest, and she breathed through it, and she was in Nevada, and she stayed in Nevada. Aaron was there to see her off. He'd already gotten his assignment, a leadership track in the Pacific, and he had the particular brightness of someone whose future had just become specific and real. Write me, he said. Sure, she said, I mean it. I want to know how the module does. If it goes anywhere. If it paused, if it helps. She looked at him. It'll help, she said. That's not confidence. That's math. He grinned. I'll hold you to that. He shook her hand with the grip of someone who had learned something about respect and was trying to communicate it through the gesture. She got in the vehicle. Lucas was at the gate on security rotation. He gave her a nod as the transport passed through, nothing elaborate, just a nod, the kind that means I see you and I was wrong about what I was seeing, and I know better now. She nodded back. Fort Granite disappeared behind her. The Joint Tactical Leadership School in Virginia was not what people imagined when they imagined military leadership training. It wasn't a high-intensity environment. It was a series of classrooms and seminar rooms and simulation suites, and the people who came through it were already soldiers. They came to learn the craft of leading other soldiers. And the curriculum was built around the understanding that commanding effectively is a learned skill that exists on top of everything else. Rebecca arrived in November. She spent the first 2 weeks doing what she always did in any new environment, studying the layout, the exits, the culture, the hierarchy, the unofficial power structures that existed underneath the official one. She attended every orientation session. She read every curriculum document. She asked questions that were specific and genuine, and occasionally made the administrative look at her twice. The way people look when the question reveals more thorough preparation than they expected. She said very little about Fort Granite. Not because she was hiding it, the record was there for anyone who looked, but because she had learned that the most useful thing about her past was not the story of what had happened, but the practical knowledge she'd extracted from it. She was building toward her first class. The module framework she'd developed at Fort Granite had moved through the review process faster than she'd expected. Brooks's co-authorship had done exactly what he'd predicted, which was to put it in front of the right people quickly, and the right people had read it and immediately understood what it was. By the time she arrived in Virginia, the module had already been formally submitted for curriculum consideration, and 2 senior faculty members had flagged it for priority review. She didn't tell anyone that. She didn't need to. She spent November preparing her first class. The students assigned to her were 11 officers in the middle stages of their careers, captains and senior lieutenants, mostly people who had enough experience to know what they didn't know and enough confidence to occasionally believe otherwise. The demographic she had most needed someone to teach her at a specific point in her own development. She understood who she was teaching. Cole came to Virginia 2 weeks before her first class. He found her in her office, a small room with a window that looked out onto the school's central courtyard, and he knocked and waited to be acknowledged, and came in and sat down, and they talked for 3 hours about everything, from the letters to the module, to the question of where the work went next. How are you? He asked toward the end. Not the professional version of the question, the actual version. She thought about it honestly. Better, she said, not finished. Better. Rachel says the trigger response is improving. It is, she paused. I'm not sure it ever goes away completely. Rachel says it may not. What changes is your relationship to it. Whether it's running you or whether you're running it. And right now? Right now I'm running it, she said. Most of the time, pause. Some days it's closer, but most of the time. Cole nodded. He looked around the office, the bare walls she hadn't decorated yet, the stacked curriculum documents, the 2 items on the corner of the desk that he'd seen before, a faded photograph in a frame, a squad patch with writing on the back. Do you miss it? He asked. Field operations. She looked at every day, she said. Some part of me always will. She paused. But I've stopped measuring myself by the fact that I'm not there anymore. It took a long time. What measure are you using now? She looked at the window for a moment. Whether the people I work with are better equipped to make the right call in the worst moment. Whether I'm giving them something they couldn't get somewhere else. She paused. Whether I'm making sure they know how to come home. Cole was quiet. Then he said, saving lives doesn't always require entering a dangerous building. No, she said. Sometimes it means preparing someone else to enter it. He looked at her across the desk. You know, he said, you're going to be the person that some of these officers remember for the rest of their careers. The instructor who changed the thing they thought they understood about leading people. She looked back at him. That's a lot of weight to put on someone who's still figuring it out herself. The best teachers always are, he said. The ones who've already got it figured out tend to stop seeing their students clearly. He stood up. He picked up his coat from the back of the chair. He was almost to the door when he stopped. He turned back, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who flew to Nevada to say something that should have been said years earlier, who had been carrying his own form of it, the weight of a truth withheld, an apology owed, a debt that official commendations don't settle. He said quietly, Lawson, take command. No emergency, no radio, no smoke. Just an office in Virginia with a window that looked out onto a courtyard and a woman at a desk who had spent 2 years believing the worst possible version of her own story and who was finally learning to believe the true one. She didn't freeze. She didn't hesitate. She said, I already have. He left. She sat at the desk for a moment after he was gone. She looked at the photograph. She looked at the patch. She looked at the 11-page module framework that had already moved 2 steps through the review process and was going to move further. Then she heard footsteps in the hallway, a group of them, the particular density of people moving in formation, students arriving for the day's first session. She stood up. She straightened her uniform. She picked up the curriculum document from the desk and tucked it under her arm. She looked at the photograph one last time, 5 faces, the sun, her own handwriting on the back, and she breathed in and she breathed out, and she was here in Virginia in the present tense, which was the only place that had ever needed her anyway. The door of her classroom was 10 feet down the hall. 11 officers were waiting on the other side of it. They didn't know yet what they were going to learn. They didn't know about Fort Granite or the building overseas or the radio with 2 voices or the 3 seconds that turned out to be the difference between being controlled by fear and being the person who ran through it. They didn't know about clear voice protocol, which they were going to use in some form for the rest of their careers. They didn't know about Aaron Pike or Derek Shaw or Brooks's early morning observation from the edge of a range or Rachel Morgan with a cup of coffee and the patience to sit and listen until truth found its way into the open air. They didn't know any of it. They were about to find out. She walked to the door. She put her hand on the handle. In the classroom behind the door, someone was saying something to someone else, and their voice overlapped for a moment with another voice, and she heard it. And she felt the familiar tightening in her chest, and she breathed through it, and she opened the door. And every face in the room turned toward her. 11 pairs of eyes, expectant, ready, carrying, each of them, their own particular weight of things survived, and things not yet tested, and things they didn't have language for yet. She knew that weight. She knew it better than any textbook could have taught her. She walked to the front of the room. She set down the curriculum document. She looked at them, each of them, one at a time, the way she looked at everything when she was paying real attention, not scanning, actually seeing. Then she said, my name is Rebecca Lawson. I am going to teach you how to lead people through the worst moment they will ever experience. And the first thing I need you to understand is that the worst moment is not the explosion, and it is not the contact, and it is not the building coming down. She paused. The worst moment is the one where the voices around you stop being distinguishable from each other, and you have to decide which one to trust. The room was completely still. That moment, she said, is what we're here for. We are going to learn how to hear clearly when everything is trying to make you deaf. We are going to learn how to lead when the system around you fails. And we are going to learn how to bring everyone home. She picked up a marker. She walked to the board, and Rebecca Lawson, who had failed 8 combat tests and been called dead weight and stood at the edge of losing everything she'd built, who had frozen in a training hallway while her teammates shouted and a clock ran down and the red marks accumulated beside her. Name who had carried 2 years of an impossible choice in silence because no one had given her the truth she needed to set it down, stepped forward and began teaching. Not because the wound was gone, not because the fear had stopped visiting, not because the 3 seconds had become 0. But because she had learned the only thing that had ever actually mattered, that what she had survived was not the end of who she was. It was the beginning of everything she had to give.